Welcome back. You're watching Network Africa here on Channels Television. About 176 world leaders and their representatives are meeting in Istanbul, Turkey to hold the world's first humanitarian summit. The summit aims to improve global humanitarian system, but has been criticized by some as just being no more than a show.
Speaking at a humanitarian summit in Istanbul, the German leader said attacks on hospitals in countries like Yemen and Syria were a flagrant violation of human rights conventions.
We need a renewed global consensus on humanitarian principles. Actually, it's a catastrophe that we have to talk about international law being met. We experience in Syria, in Yemen, and other countries systematic attacks on hospitals. Health centers are being destroyed and doctors losing their lives. This is flagrantly against humanitarian principles.
Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan said his country expects a fairer sharing of the burden of dealing with refugees, reiterating that Turkey is hosting the highest number of refugees in the world. Turkey is a country hosting the most refugees in the world, according to the United Nations records. I'm sure you are aware of how much burden it brought to us. On the other hand, Turkey did not receive a necessary contribution in this role from the international community. We expect a fairer sharing of the burden on refugee issues. Turkey is sheltering nearly 3 million Syrian refugees at a cost of around $10 billion since the start of the Syrian civil war. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon also called on government, businesses and aid groups at the UN's first World Humanitarian Summit to commit to halving the number of displaced civilians by 2030.
I urge you to commit to cutting half the number of internally displaced people by 2030 and to find better long-term solutions for refugees and displaced people based on more equal sharing of responsibilities.
The two-day summit in Istanbul seeks to develop a better response to what the UN has called the worst global humanitarian situation since World War II, with an estimated 130 million people now in need of aid. The summit aims to mobilize funds and get world leaders to agree on issues ranging from how to manage displaced civilians to renewed commitment to international humanitarian law. But it risks falling short of ambitions. Aid agency Médecins Sans Frontières pulled out in May, saying it lost hope the conference would address weaknesses in emergency response. Host country Turkey has called the international humanitarian aid system broken.
The VOA's Doreen Jones joins us now from Istanbul with more on the summit. Doreen, thanks for joining us on Network Africa. What is the main focus of this summit?
Well, there's been 5 objectives outlined by the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Among them is basically calling for a change in mentality and in the world community addressing what he described as this unprecedented level of refugees, over 130 million, levels not seen since the end of World War II. It basically says that the present system is broken. There needs to be a new mentality, a new way of addressing this. This involves greater cooperation, greater solidarity, refugee sharing the burden among financially as well as dealing with the numbers. And also, he also talked about a change of mentality about dealing with the assistance and aid that is distributed, more being sent to the front line, to agencies who are dealing right on the front line with this crisis. There's been a lot of concern that money is just simply being frittered away in the administration, is not getting to those who are most in need. And on top of that, is addressing the question of international law. This is seen as extremely important because a number of aid agencies are being worried about the growing number of attacks on, in particular, hospitals in conflict zones. Médecins Sans Frontières in the last year or so has had 75 of its hospitals targeted in attacks. And this is seen as a new precedent and a very worrying development. So there's calls there to enforce international law.
Dorian, I'd like to pick up on what the critics are saying, that it's been more than a year, it's been almost a year since the migrant crisis started in Europe. And why now? Because it does seem a bit late, you know.
Well, indeed. In fact, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon suggested this conference 4 years ago, and what he's saying is he was vindicated. He says the situation is getting worse and worse. I think that there is this, I think, acceptance that anything that can be achieved at this summit is going to take time to achieve. There's no magic wand. There's talk about this being a launch pad for new initiatives going forward. There is this acceptance, basically, that very little of major consequence can be achieved, purely because not many of the world leaders are attending. None of the big beasts of international diplomacy are here, other than the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, and a couple of others. There's a great deal of disappointment there. If you speak to UN officials, they say, they shrug their shoulders when you have a NATO summit. You get all the big people here to attend, whereas it's something about refugees and humanitarian. It's a really struggle to get people to attend, although they said in the last week or so they did manage to get more people than they were hoping, than they were expecting. So there is this, I think, acknowledgement that not major things can be achieved at this summit, but it could be the start of a process. But beyond that, I mean, speaking to NGOs, there are several thousand delegates here. Many of them are NGOs working on the front line. These sorts of summits are useful. It brings them together, exchanges experiences, ideas, what works, what don't work. And I think it's even a question of morale boosting here, because many of these people do feel isolated when they're on the front line. Summits like this does manage to restore some confidence. And I think that is seen as something significant as well.
Dorian, you mentioned that none of the big guns are there except German Chancellor Angela Merkel and the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, as well as the Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan. But for the other leaders who are not there, what are they saying about, you know, the humanitarian situation? Have they shown any commitment, perhaps from where they are, to either this summit or perhaps the humanitarian crisis in Europe?
Well, on the I mean, in fact, the leaders attending here have been keeping quite a low profile. There haven't been any major groundbreaking statements being made at all. In fact, most of the statements have been done that have come across to the people working on the front line. I mean, we have had these strong statements from Angela Merkel when she did turn up and address an issue that all countries in the front line of receiving refugees have been saying, that when you have these big summits and when the big leaders do turn up, they make these pledges of huge amounts of money. And then when it comes to collecting the money, they're nowhere to be found. In fact, the latest figures have been given. Only 1/6 of money pledged by international community is being honored. And in fact, the German Chancellor said that is simply unacceptable. And I think that is music to the ear of countries like Turkey. In fact, the Turkish president, in addressing the opening of the summit, made the point that they've spent over $10 billion hosting around 3 million refugees, and have only received $445 million from the international community. A lot more pledges, but that's the only amount of money that's arrived. So there's this feeling, countries like Jordan, Lebanon too, feel that that the international community, the wealthy countries, aren't being honest. They make these statements when the press are there, but when it comes to paying up, they're nowhere to be found.
Well, speaking of Turkey, is there discussion concerning the EU-Turkish deal?
Well, very much so. In fact, the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, sat down with her Turkish counterpart to discuss this very important deal, whereby Turkey has said that it will do all its efforts to stop the migrants from leaving Turkey to enter Greece. And in exchange, they will also receive all the migrants that do enter Greece illegally. They will accept back in exchange that the EU will accept an equal number from Syrian refugee camps in Turkey. This deal is seen as crucial. In fact, it has been successful. The number of migrants leaving Turkey to Greece has fallen from thousands a day to a mere trickle. And one day there were none at all. So from the German perspective, of which Germany's received over 1 million refugees last year, this is seen as a very important deal and is working. But there is a lot of problems, in particular because part of this deal was the EU would promise Turks visa-free travel to much of Europe. That is breaking down because Turkey is refusing to comply with some of the 72 demands that the EU requires, in particular human rights questions, anti-terror law and things, reforming its anti-terror law. Turkey is refusing to do that. There is an impasse. In fact, the German Chancellor, speaking to the media after a meeting, said the expected start of this deal, which was expected to start on July the 1st, she said that's not expected until sometime in the autumn. And it has to be said, both sides really are skeptical whether this deal can be sustainable going forward. At the moment, it's just a question of just keeping it going from month to month, especially in the summer. Come the autumn, I think a lot of people expect that deal to break down.
Dorian, I really appreciate you joining us on Network Africa and breaking this down for us. We do hope leaders arrive at logical conclusions at the end of that summit. The VOA's Dorian Jones from Istanbul, Turkey. When we come back after the break on Network Africa, women in Egypt are ditching the norm and car racing. Do stay with us.